When most people hear the word Sabbath, they think of rules, restrictions, or religious debates. But in the Bible, Shabbat begins somewhere very different. It begins with rest as a gift, not a burden. Before laws, before nations, before religious systems. Today, we're going to look back carefully at what Scripture actually says about Shabbat, from creation to Israel to Jesus himself, and why it still matters in a world that is exhausted. Shabbat at creation. Shabbat does not begin with Moses. It begins at creation. In Genesis 2, after creating the heavens and the earth, Scripture says God rested on the seventh day, not because he was tired, but because rest was being set apart as holy. God blesses the seventh day. He sanctifies it. That means rest is woven into the structure of creation itself. The first time Israel is commanded to keep Shabbat is not at Mount Sinai. It happens earlier in Exodus 16 with the manna. God provides daily bread, but on the sixth day he gives double, so the people can rest on the seventh. Shabbat here is about trust. Trust that God will provide even when you stop gathering. This is a radical idea for former slaves, people whose survival once depended on constant labor. Rest requires trust. In Exodus 20, God formally commands Shabbat in the Ten Commandments. And notice the reason given. In Exodus, Shabbat is tied to creation. In Deuteronomy, it is tied to deliverance from slavery. Shabbat says you are not defined by production. You are no longer owned by Pharaoh. Rest becomes a declaration of freedom. In Exodus 31, God calls Shabbat a sign between himself and his people, a sign that they belong to him. Even more striking, in Exodus 34, God commands rest even during harvest, the busiest season, the moment when stopping feels most dangerous. Shabbat declares that provision comes from God, not from endless effort. Where God lists his appointed times, Shabbat comes first. Before feasts, before festivals. Weekly rest is the foundation of God's calendar. In Jeremiah 17, God warns Israel about turning Shabbat into a day of commerce, carrying burdens, opening markets, treating rest as optional. Later in Nehemiah 13, the same struggle appears again. Economic pressure pushes against obedience. The question becomes clear. Will you trust God or the market? By the time of Jesus, Shabbat had become heavy with rules. Jesus did not abolish Shabbat. He restores its purpose. In Matthew 11, Jesus invites the weary to find rest in him. In Mark 2, he declares, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." In Luke 4, Jesus' custom is to be in the synagogue on the Sabbath. There he heals and restores. Jesus shows us that Shabbat is about life, mercy, and restoration. Shabbat reminds us that we are not machines, that time belongs to God, that rest is an act of trust. In a world shaped by constant productivity, Shabbat stands as a quiet, faithful resistance. It echoes God's day of rest after creation and foretold the coming of Christ the Messiah.